Just give me a second to set up my timer. I'll be starting my speech in I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The most lethal way a person can tell you that you don't matter is via the power of words. I want to first frame to you what does linguistic behavior look like. Within linguistic behavior means that the use of your language, this looks like it can anything that range from the way that you send messages into the group chat, the way that you speak to a person affects not only that the way you think about yourself, i.e. the way that you interpret and see yourself, but also affects the way that you're externally perceived. This looks like, for example, a lot of speakers that are perceived to be charismatic use a lot of assertive lexicons. Next, what does feminine linguistic behavior look like then? Within this form of linguistic behavior, it often involves language and the use of any form of word that often paints a picture of you being a submissive person, paints a picture of you of a hesitant behavior, and one that often puts yourself at the background as opposed to the limelight. It paints yourself also in a more emotional and frantic light. I want to note here is that the use of feminine linguistic behavior is not always bad and not always fundamentally bad, because we concede that it is a form of expression and it can be a form of bonding amongst women as well. However, there are two key problems to this, which is that number one, that insofar it is true that patriarchal structures are things that are incredibly entrenched and are hard to change, this means that a majority of the perceptions towards feminine linguistic behavior is often one that is negative. It is often one to be perceived as something that is weak, as something that's submissive. And because it is very hard to topple these static perceptions, this means that it means that right now it's incredibly important that the demand for respect for women in social spheres is extremely important by actively discouraging and shifting away from these feminine linguistic behaviors. Second problem is that currently masculine linguistic behavior is already on the rise and have become more radical. This looks like your alpha male language that is now laced with a lot of lexicon and violence that is often targeted towards women. This means that the continued use of feminine linguistic behaviors enables this form of entrenchment because it allows the gap of feminine and masculine linguistic behaviors to be one that's more glaring and is often one at the expense of women's spaces. Next, is that the idea of feminine linguistic behavior, the way it affects women internally, is that because it tells you that you ought to intrinsically behave in a submissive way, it indoctrinates you to believe that your presence is one that is secondary, that all your opinions here must be in the form of I think rather than I must. This means that this is a form of lethal subliminal way to tell yourself that you don't matter. This is important because the language that you use not only tells other people what you want, but also shapes your own social reality and identity. It shapes the way that you perceive yourself. This is already incredibly damaging, given that in the status quo, women are already positioned inferior compared to women. This therefore just cements the idea of this. Next, the way it affects externally is that the use of feminine, sorry, what?
I actually lost a bit of connection for the last 20 seconds or so. So like I have you with like 4 minutes and 50 seconds left. And I can tell you the exact point at which like I cut off in terms of your material. So if you can just like restart from there, that'd be great. So we're talking about male linguistic behavior, talking about alpha male language and how this enables problematic behavior. After that, I just cut off. So you've got like 4 minutes and 50 seconds left.
All right, sure, no problem. I'll just start in 3, 2, 1. So therefore, the problem of masculine linguistic behavior is that the continued use of feminine linguistic behaviors therefore enables this form of entrenchment because it allows the gap of feminine and masculine linguistic behavior to be one that is more glaring. Next, on how this affects therefore women internally is that because this form of feminine linguistic behavior affects intrinsic submissive behavior because it tells you that you ought to behave in a submissive way. This means that indoctrinates you to believe that your presence is one that is secondary compared to other people. We think this is a form of dangerous subliminal way to tell yourself that you don't matter compared to other people. This means that the language you use shapes your social reality and the way that you perceive your own identity compared to other people. This is very damaging because women are already positioned to be more inferior compared to men. Next, externally, is that it is very bad because it often sidelines women's voices because of the jarring comparison of the language that is used around you. People use words like I must versus you are using words like maybe. I want to note that it is not just exclusive to misogynists. Rather, this is a general subconscious prejudice that has already been entrenched within society for centuries. Before I move on, sure, I'll take one P1. 3, 2, 1. Okay, how does it look like when we actively discourage? We don't think it must come from the angle of shaming. Rather, actively discourage can also look like spreading information and awareness of this without actively shaming women. Why? Because number one is that because this is something that affects everyone, and everyone does use some form of feminine linguistic behavior in some point or another, in some point of their lives, this means it's unlikely any form of shaming and villainization will happen. Also, secondarily, is that you can always use empirical studies and research that already exists to sort of show and prove that it is because of women's psychological presence that is one who have already been submissive, therefore we ought to challenge this. Also, thirdly, because this form of feminist linguistic behavior is already one that's incredibly subtle form of micro behavior with micro impact to society, therefore it already requires a large chunk of information awareness. This means it is unlikely that shaming is going to be the strategy and mechanism that this feminist movement is going to use. The comparative is that we want women to be empowered and to be encouraged to use a more assertive form of language. The impact here is on two folds. Number one, now women's social spaces are perceived as more important. I'll take one. Fazlan.
I don't understand how your internalization argument works, because assuming these women don't change and they still continue these things, the internalization is far worse when the feminist movement is calling you wrong as well.
Okay, I'll explain this on the impacts, okay? First, on externally, why you're perceived as more important, because women's voices are no longer drowned out. Because in the status quo, when most women are using these kinds of more submissive language, the use of more assertive language therefore directly challenges this. I want to note, in a status quo, a lot of women already want to use more assertive language, but often not perceived as legitimate because the feminist movement does not endorse this, and because there are so many other women that still want to maintain docile. But now that we endorse it, we think we legitimize the idea that assertive language is that something that all women ought to use. Therefore, you stand out, and therefore now you capture the limelight of a lot of discussion. I want to note here, even if you don't buy this, I will not answer the POI why this is still good for individual empowerment. Number one is that the idea that in the long term, you break the psychological glass ceiling that you should always default to submissive language. It's about the psychology internally of now using more assertive language that is able to empower women internally. This looks like consciously, cognitively shifting towards and choosing more assertive lexicons. This looks like slowly changing from choosing words like I think to I believe to we must. This gradual shift towards assertiveness therefore translates the confidence within women that is able to bleed towards other aspects of life as well. This means that women are now more likely to speak up and contribute to discussions because they don't believe that their words are being drowned out, because now that they see they are no longer being heard because of the use of submissive language. But now when they're choosing to be more assertive in their language, they can see that the kind of effects of assertiveness is now being heard. This means they're more likely to now speak up and contribute, and now their voices are being heard. Propose.
We thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, inviting on the Leader of Opposition here.
Hi, audible?
Could you be a bit louder, please?
Hi, can you hear me?
This is perfect.
POIs verbally, I prefer after 5 minutes, I'll ask for it. The movement that once fought for women to speak freely now tells women how exactly to speak. We think that it is extremely contradictory and absolutely not in the best interest of feminist movements to apply this kind of restrictions on women on how they should speak and on how they should act. Framing, I'll integrate my responses here. On proliferation, we think that this entire idea of how women usually linguistically act come by only because women didn't want those around them to feel vindicated. Because what Eunsi talks about patriarchal structures are indeed entrenched, correct, but we are also organically shifting towards a space where both genders are recognized. But because of these centuries of propagation, we think that women oftentimes don't want to be seen as vindicated, don't want to vindicate other people or want to be more accepted and easily mixing into that community, that their circle that they're in. It shows the tone of their conversation, which is beneficial in many virtual and also physical spaces, regardless of gender, which is something that we want to point out. But number two, if feminism movement, like this move forces women to conceive with only a specific lexicon, it is a backward strike. Because number one, those safe spaces where women have to subscribe to a specific way of speaking, it compromises their identity. But also number two, no woman should be seen as lesser, as in whether they act more masculine or not, it's up to them. Whether they're assertive or whether they're softer in speaking, it is entirely up to them. How social movements usually work is that number one, they oftentimes don't want to be exclusionary. They oftentimes want everyone within them to be involved. This means that all women, regardless of how they speak, are also under this social movement, and it is up to them to protect all women regardless of how they speak. This also allows people the autonomy, women exactly, on how exactly they want to and engage in this language. Because we think that when you actively discourage, it's something that these women are going to be shamed. But on how actively discouragement looks like, we think that it looks like calling out women immediately during conversations. Number two, explicitly shaming people who say maybe instead of using assertive language. But also number three, feminist movement will actively push out people who speak in feminine linguistic behaviors. So it's something that is extremely like villainizing or like shaming explicitly. Arguments then. Number one, this is principally inconsistent. Why? Because this social movement that is supposed to support you, supposed to protect you from men who is supposed to be seen as quote unquote the enemy, they're now telling you to leave because you're speaking in a more feminine way instead of a more neutral or more masculine way that they want to see as more powerful. We think that this is exclusionary, and this goes against the whole idea of protecting women because it is counterintuitive to leave women out just because they don't do what exactly your new ideals are. You are choosing people with feminine behaviors and telling them that they are lesser. You are mocking them. You are excluding this woman. This compounds a divide between women themselves, which is also extremely detrimental in terms of practical sense, which I'll go into as well. This builds a binary wherein people with no feminine traits are now going to be seen as more powerful. A woman with more masculine traits are going to be seen as correct. Just because they speak louder, just because they speak up during a board meeting, they're going to be seen as better than other women. We think that this perpetuates the gap and implies that one is more valuable than the other. This means that you have to speak like a man in order to be seen as correct. You have to speak like a man in order to be seen as a whole woman who supports the feminist movement. Even if there's no idea on what kind of choice you want to make in terms of the language that you use, we think that we at least protect more vulnerable parties. This means that women who want to engage in more feminine linguistic behavior, because these women are oftentimes, they're not going to be suddenly, they have like this psychological cognitive function. They're just going to flip a switch and just tell them, oh, you have to speak like a man now immediately. Because oftentimes a lot of women also exist in board of directors rooms. This looks like in politics, in like CEO rooms, like it's very difficult to suddenly tell women just to act exactly like a man, because it is very easy to get vindicated by men themselves instead of only just from the woman that Prop wants to talk to you about. Number two, this also talks about individual empowerment, because when Eunsi tells you how psychologically you have this want to act in a specific way, yet your movement tells you you're wrong, we think that is extremely detrimental because this is conflicting. It's very easy to understand that if you understand A and your movement tells you that you're wrong, you're contradicting, it is something that you will feel guilt for. You'll likely feel disconnected from that movement that you're supposed to be connected as well. even if best case, women who speak femininely still is considered within that movement, within the feminist movement, they will likely participate in different ways because it's going to be at the expense of being uncomfortable, which is not the best way because you're not going to be very connected to feminist movement, regardless of what they push. Oftentimes you're going to try to find out flaws because, hey, it's not something that supported me when I wanted to act in more feminine ways anyway. Why should I support it anyway? But number two, it alienates women who actually do want to be within that movement. And that critical mass of that social movement that you want to talk about, it will also be watered down because it is splintered and you lose support from that woman. Women who want to act in feminine ways will go ahead regardless of how you want to control or try to criticize them. And this leads to a disunification where not all women will support the same ideals, which will lead to practical impacts as well. Before I go into my second argument, Akasyah.
So are you saying that your comparative is that you want men to adhere to you?
No, the comparative is women can act in whatever ways they want. They want to speak in feminine linguistic behavior. They want to use a neutral linguistic behavior. They want to use assertive masculine linguistic behavior. That is entirely still up to them. We don't think there should be a control or limit on how exactly women should act. My practical argument here then, we think that this propagation will only lead to the solidification of patriarchal narratives because it is very difficult to make feminist policies when you're actively telling women that, hey, you should act like a man when these things are going to be seen by the men around you because they want you to bow down to whatever policies they want. They're going to see this as you're already adhering to our linguistic practices anyway. Why not you follow to other practices that we are going to be imposing as well? When it's a black and white between men and women, and your women are actively discouraging other women as well, this makes for extremely difficult guidance between women when in the very first place, like suffrage, women's suffrage, feminism, it grew from a way of allowing women to speak. It grew from a place where women actively supported each other instead of throwing criticization to each other. This also means that it excludes most of your voter base, since when many of them use it in status quo, where many women do still engage in feminine linguistic behavior, it's very difficult to tell women to say, just suddenly say stop. Don't say I think, don't say maybe. You have to be more assertive. Unless you can actively actually prove the link of converting these people into more masculine or neutral ways, they will still continue regardless and continue being alienated as well. It's very difficult to agree on matters and therefore we think opposition.
We thank the Leader of Opposition for the fine speech, inviting on the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Okay. Two questions. First, should the movement have the authority to do this? And secondly, is feminine linguistic behavior that harmful? First, should the feminist movement have the authority to do this? Because the opposition case is entirely dependent on two premises. The first being that feminist movement cannot tell women what to do. And second is that women won't change their behavior. I will contend with both. First, the choice feminism argument that their side says feminist movement can't tell women what to do. But this depends on absolute choice feminism being an inherent good. Here are reasons why it's not. First, because it assumes the choice is made freely, but often the tendency to use such language is based on subconscious internalization. We are told that this is your role as a woman in order to be more submissive. This is part of your gender identity or is seen as a necessary blueprint in order to get into positions of power, which means this choice isn't one they can claim is empowering. But second, it reduces their net choice in the long term. If it puts women in a position where they're less likely to get job opportunities, less likely to get promoted because they're associated with a set of negative qualities that these social structures do not want, then it reduces their choices. So given the trade-off, we will rather take away one choice from women right now. If this maximizes their choices overall, it's a compromise we are happy to make, given that women can't get choice overall on everything either way. The second sub-contention here is whether or not the precise method of advocacy is going to be one that's shameful. But all the reasons this team give for why the movement cares for women and cares for their well-being is precisely why the method of advocacy won't tend towards shame, but will be informational by providing a counter narrative for what women should do, rather than saying you are actively anti-feminist for using this language. Here were Eunsi's reasons that went completely unresponded to. The first is that the feminist movement is comprised of other women who likely have personal social relationships with women that they're communicating this message to. So if you're talking to your children or talking to your friends and family, it's very unlikely that you'll say you are actively unfeminist. This is not just propagated by the movement overall, but individual leaders showing how this language could be harmful. The second is that being informational is the best way to be convincing. And the reason why is because there's no immediate harm to language. Like, it's very difficult for people to explain in concrete terms why language leads to psychological changes. But the way that the feminist movement wants to make their advocacy convincing is to prove the harm. So they point to psychological studies. They point to actual scientific research which explains why this puts women in the worst position than they otherwise would be. So the best way to make the advocacy convincing is to be more informational, and it's not to be shameful. Like, for all the reasons they give on fracturing is precisely why the movement won't do their method, which is just quite bad. Secondly, will women change their behavior? Here's why they will. The first is that a lot of women don't recognize the harm of using this linguistic behavior. So now that the movement is able to spotlight that harm because it's not afraid to do so, people are able to realize why it's harmful and shift away from it. But second, a lot of women, even if they recognize the harm, think that right now, well, it's a compromise I'm willing to make for my linguistic vocabulary because it's the only way for me to succeed. Now we overcome that shame of being the first one to try by collective action. The feminist movement propagating this narrative and doing this discouragement is what gives women the collective confidence to abandon feminine linguistic behavior and move forward with more assertive things. That never happens on their side. On their side, women never gain the individual autonomy to feel like they can get into more assertive behavior because they feel like they're not powerful enough, but now the movement actively backs their choice. Their final claim is that this splinters the movement. This is the most boring social movement argument ever. Any policy position could create fracturing. You ought not adjudicate on the basis something might fracture the movement. Our claim is that there will always be disagreements within the movement. There are people that already disagree that the fact that the feminist movement is currently just neglecting this problem and pretending like it doesn't exist. Those people will get upset with the movement for doing nothing. They would also fracture. You ought to weigh then on the basis which thing actually does more harm, which leads into the second issue. Is feminine linguistic behavior that harmful? So if we believe that feminine linguistic behavior does more harm than good, it is a moral failure of the movement if they fail to highlight the subtle damage that this behavior does, independent of the outcome. So in principle, if this is bad, the movement should oppose it. The contention we get from OP is that feminine linguistic behavior is women's unique advantage, because if you can't beat men at their own game, at least you leverage your strength of being more emotional. Note that even if this is normalized among women, it doesn't change norms about what social structures value. Look at society right now. Workplaces still value you being confident. Politics still value you being decisive. Like, reality spits in the face of what.
Hi, Umar. So you cut off with about 3 minutes and 15 seconds to go. You were talking about on the second mechanism of why women will change their behavior in terms of how they overcome the shame of discouragement, gain acceptability.
Sorry, so could you say it again? It's about why women would change their behavior.
Yeah, the second mechanism.
Okay.
Hey, just off your camera, man.
Okay. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, so these people are able to change because we give women the collective confidence to abandon the behavior and tell them that there are other people out there so they don't feel the shame of being the one that stands out. Their final claim is that this splinters the movement. This is an incredibly boring argument. Like, any policy position could create fracturing. So you need to adjudicate this on the basis of which position does more harm than good. Because presumably, some people will be pissed off if the movement doesn't do anything about this and allows this bad behavior to continue seeping through our language. So those people would also fracture off. Which leads to the second issue. Is feminine linguistic behavior harmful? If we believe that it is, it's a moral failure of the movement if they fail to highlight the subtle damage the feminine linguistic behavior does. The contention we get from OP is that this behavior is good because it's women's unique advantage if you can't beat men at their own game. But note, even if it's normalized among women, it doesn't change norms about what social structures value. Look at society right now. workplaces still value you being confident. Politics still value you being decisive. So even if women embrace this as a strength, it's not embraced as a strength by society. The women in boardrooms that Elo talks about are women that had the privilege of breaking free from the docile outlook that other women were socialized into, because they had career coaches. They were born into an elite class that allowed them to be confident. What we're doing is letting those women stand up. So on the metric of vulnerable women, we teach vulnerable women the language of corporate success that they previously were socialized out of. I'll take a POI.
If the patriarchy is as bad as you want to say, then how can you prove that even if they take up this masculine language, they're going to be as successful, which is what your arguments are contingent on?
Okay, I will take you at your best. What if men retaliate to the woman being more assertive? Good. That forces them to rationalize their thought process and decision making when engaging with women's ideas. It invites confrontation, but that confrontation is out in the open for us to critique and expose, because now they have to deal with the logic of women's ideas and the logic of what women are saying, rather than just trying to pull the wool over their eyes and pretend that those ideas don't exist. So why is this important? This line of argument assumes that being confident and assertive is a man's only thing, as what LO says. But that's because you associate it as being a man's only thing. But now when women are able to get that language, reclaim it as their own, we get things like girl boss feminism and so on. So why is this important? The problem is that right now, this reinforces a lot of stereotypes about women. It reinforces the notion that women are emotional, are indecisive, and most critical of all, the overuse of feminine linguistic behavior has bred a subculture of feminine language where they lean into their femininity excessively, where they lean into things like, I'm just a girl math, girlhood. All of these things subconsciously make women try to find some form of satisfaction in a notion that makes them weaker. But in reality, these are things that further breed into the mold of whatever their gender norms tell them that they are. Now, none of these all of these stereotypes may immediately confer negative treatment. So maybe women being more outwardly emotional could lead to men caring for them more. But being pushed into a corner because men believe you are a damsel in distress isn't a good thing. And that's an actively harmful thing, because it limits to what extent you are able to achieve things on your own, and it ties things towards your gender. Overall, it is true that some women are socialized into being docile. Maybe some of them won't change immediately, but that is why it's the movement's obligation to provide a counter narrative to tell them that they can be more than what they are right now. On their side, they will be stagnant. They will allow women to feed into that socialization forever and tell them that they can never be more, because otherwise doing so would be a man. For those reasons, you have to propose.
We thank the Deepam for that fine speech and writing on the TLO. TLO?
Oh, I think our DLO is having problems with his mic. Could you just give us a minute?
Yeah.
Sorry?
No, you're lagging, bro.
You are.
Hello, hello. Yeah, am I audible, visible? Alamak.
You're not visible, you're audible.
Yeah, so but just checking audible.
Yeah, you're audible, you're audible.
Oh, all right, cool. Okay, I'm just my time now. Sorry. This government team no longer fights against the patriarchy. It's an acceptance of defeat. When the only way that they say to make women get empowerment, get women in jobs, or make sure that they can also be bosses is by co-opting every single thing that men do, I think that's an acknowledgement that is already a defeat. I think their side is the side that struggles against the patriarchy. I want to do a few things in my speech. I'm just going to answer 3 questions and explain as to why these are reasons as to why we ultimately win the round. The first thing is I want to deal with the idea of alpha male language and how this becomes more glaring. This was somewhat dropped by Umar, but I'm just going to explain as to why this argument just doesn't really make sense. Because if there is a divide between the language that men and women use, and it's clear that alpha male language is one that's toxic and bad, then there is no reason as to why any of this changes in either side, right? Like, clearly, this is something that is glaring and obvious and problematic. These are things that will get stopped and called out on both worlds. But 2 is that even if you do co-opt all these things, I'm unsure as to how you decide as to what's value neutral language versus what's male dominated. I think at the point at which that you say don't use feminine language, it makes it difficult for you to be able to actually assess as to where these problems are coming from. So if anything, and if this is a case that you're willing to buy, the harms therefore are government, because their side is the team that sides the fact that you don't want to use feminine language and you want to incorporate something else. But the second thing I want to deal with, from coming up from Ernsi as well as Umar, is the idea is how you increase the use of assertive language, and you perceive them as something that's more important. I just want to note that I think it's an extremely difficult burden that Gov tries to defend, and I don't think that they've successfully proved it. Because the problem that they had with how people treat women in the first place is the idea of patriarchy as a whole. They say that, oh, even if we do get people who are calling out and coming out with the confidence, you get some form of confrontation, and that is good. I'm unsure as to why this is good anyway, because the reason as to why men, like the patriarchy even exists, isn't because that women are talking in a way that's submissive, is because just how shit men are. And so the same things will still exist under both sides of the house. The very least, we're protecting women by allowing them to use the language that they want to. Moving on then with the extensions and then incorporating other things that I want to use in response. The first thing I want to deal with is the idea of consistency and principle, because I think Gov dies on this. Because they say that women language isn't assertive enough. I think that's a glaring acceptance that you're using to say that the language is one that's bad, because that means that everyone that does use that language is a person that is no longer correct in using so, and the feminist movement tells you that is wrong. Umar says it's likely going to be informational in the way that we discourage women from using these forms of behavior in the first place. Few things, right? Number one, if people know that confidence is something that's important in the workplace, that is regardless of whether or not you're a man or a woman, if that is true and that is something that people do value very heavily within board of directors or senior positions, these are things that the feminist movement can also encourage women to do. It isn't about changing the way in which that you have behaviors. The outcome in the way in which that you get that is through confidence. There isn't a reason as to why you need to remove feminine linguistic behaviors in order to achieve the same confidence that they say is required to be able to obtain their benefits. There is no link to prove as to why the removal of these forms of feminine behaviors is what gives you that same benefit. But number 2 is that I'm unsure as to what that actively discourage even looks like, because they say that, oh, it's likely going to be informational. But what does that even mean? Because if you see people using I think or maybe or ... and emoticons on text, for example, does that mean that you don't call them out? Does that mean that you send them pamphlet and a presentation as to why you shouldn't do this, like it's very confusing. And more importantly, is that I think that people will want to discourage this, given how much harm that you say that using these forms of behaviors is even in the first place. So that means every time someone wants to send a Mr. Cup sticker or emoji into the group chat, you're likely to see it as someone that's using feminine behaviors and therefore call them out for doing so. And that's one that's difficult, because that means that you still have to process every single thing that you want to send, whether or not it's seen as feminine behavior, whether or not it's seen as something that's assertive. And all of these things don't matter that much in the grand scheme as to how they're going to be viewed in society to begin with. Their burden of trying to overthrow patriarchy isn't going to be something that's going to be resolved, because these are things that will still happen regardless. You will still have these individuals who will be seeing women as weak, and you'll see them as not assertive and not valuable in the workplace, for example. But the second thing I want to deal with is more on the practical side of what this behavior even brings. I want to note that government's main contribution for this in this clash particularly is about helping individual women specifically, is the idea of how you break that psychological glass ceiling and you shift to things that are using more assertive lexicons, and that gains confidence. Why is this the way in which you need to make women gain confidence? You can make women gain confidence without forcing them to use masculine vocabulary, or forcing them to not to give up certain parts of an identity, because that is purely their form of freedom of expression and the way in which that they want to do. So Umar says choice feminism can be bad. We say sure, whatever. That isn't the case that we are trying to run, because what we are trying to prove is that the women should be able to express themselves in the way in which that they want to. If they choose to do so, go ahead, because the harms of doing it isn't something that you prove directly relates to how your benefits materialize under your side. Before I continue, I'll take the PY.
So your claim is that confidence and assertiveness are male-associated behaviors. Do you support a permanent segmentation of language based on associated genders?
Okay, so that POI just proves that you're not paying attention, because I didn't say it's male-associated behaviors. I'm saying it's human-associated behaviors. It doesn't matter what kind of language that you're using in order to gain forms of confidence, which means confidence is something that can still be used as what feminist movement wants to push towards women in general. But the way in which that you do that and the language that you use to speak in that is one that we shouldn't use and control as the way in which that you choose as to whether or not this is something that is good or bad. So the way in which that we perceive information and we perceive as to whether or not women is assertive isn't by the language that they use, because that's just the way they want to express themselves, and that is something that we ought to protect. Because in the very least, the only way that government can claim their benefits is by breaking down the patriarchy. And the comparative of scale is that as long as you have fun using emoticons, or you enjoy expressing yourself in that way, that's already a net positive for women, and that's something that you ought to credit, because that is a certainty that you can measure within the round. The delta is that even if you do change your behaviors, things like the patriarchy will still exist. There will still be blatant sexism that is very, very difficult to call out. Umar says that you have more ability to call this out because it's direct and you can actually show it. But that's the same for a lot of other things that women have to go through. The gender pay gap is a perfect example, because these are people who still work the same amount of hours, for example, and produce the same amount of quality of work. And there is mechanisms to prove as to why this is something that is just as useful as their male counterparts. But you still have people that will fight against this, because society is entrenched in that way. The ability to break down patriarchy is one that's extremely difficult, and forcing them out of using feminist linguistics isn't a way in order to achieve this. At the very least, we protect women by how they want to express themselves. And if it's fun, bro. Let them send their Mr. Cup stickers, and that's how we're in the debate. Thank you.
We thank the DLO for the fine speech, inviting on the government whip speaker here.
All right, am I audible and visible? Okay,
Yes.
if you do lag, you can just tell me when you lagged out, and I will restart my speech. One sec, I'll set up my timer. I'll take a POI verbally, preferably at the 5th minutes onward. But I'll take one after frame if OP has one. Oh, not really frame, just challenges. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think it's extremely disingenuous that opposition attempts to dispel a lot of the net harms that we talked to you about when it comes to feminist language by just saying let people make their decisions. I think it's very clear, set out from NC, why necessarily there's a large chunk of net harm the moment in which feminist language becomes the norm. It is about trajectory. It is about necessarily how we see this becoming a bigger problem in the future. The explanations was twofold. I'll go into it deeper, but the main crux of it was simply about the psychology and the psyche of women, but also practical outlets when it comes to discussions, when it comes to boardrooms, and necessarily everything else that comes along with it. Therefore, the first thing I want to dispel coming out from opposition was this Mac challenge on actively discourage. Because Tanish tries to be cheeky and says, oh, how does actively discourage actually look like? I think it was very clear from Unsi and Umar that it's about a positive feedback loop, about explaining as to how necessarily you need to be more assertive within workplaces, necessarily how feminist linguistics isn't one that's great, etc. So this oftentimes means in any way and form and shape that this is about positively making people change the ways in which they operate. But secondly then, which is the idea around, you don't need to remove FIB or feminist language in order to gain confidence. I think the first question that they need to answer, or in order for them to actually mechanize this as an attack, is to explain as to why or how this actually operates. How do you encourage this confidence within women when it comes to workplaces, etc.? This is something that's far-fetched. They don't really tell you. At the very least, what Garth posits to you is that this is a one known pathway to attaining this confidence by virtue of those confidence, etc., by virtue of the way you talk to people, because of how naturally society operates, because of how people gravitate around charisma, gravitate around assertiveness and confidence. By virtue of that, then, what makes sure and is the nail in the coffin within opposition is the moment in time they feel their own burdens. Their own burdens was to deal with how necessarily their alternatives. Because I'm going to now then explain to you what fills up the gap that exists within their case. Therefore, clash analysis that I want to do is to talk about choice versus holistic impact. Because notice the one thing that they stand within opposition was the idea around choice and why it's inherently important. The first question that I want to answer is as to why choice is never always a good thing if choice holistically affects each and every woman on the ground. We explained to you via analysis that feminism linguistics isn't new. This has been a procedurally, structurally subliminal form of male dominance that we women believe that they should use like language such as if and maybe when it comes to talking in conversations because it makes you seem more more accommodating, etc. It is also how necessarily we come to understand because now women aren't able to break glass ceilings by virtue of how language is used to make sure that you are submissive. But secondly, it is the understanding about what is the implicit counter proposal within opposition, because opposition's counter proposal cannot be that you just be enjoy your language, because there must be some implications, because if that's their only case, then the impact is extremely shallow and I don't see why they need to win this debate. But the implicit counter proposal actually within opposition is for men to become more accommodating in order for you to be able to dominate those work spheres, in so far as you don't have any active steps to attempting to regain power within those places. It is exactly within op world that you become passive, exactly within op world that men become more dominating and more likely than not become worse off. But the second thing, and this was a response to this, because the idea was that backlash is bad because men are shit. This was Tanish's response, right? That you can't change the way structure men works. But it is through our analysis that prove to you that only when you're able to challenge those challenge that dominating sphere, we're able to call out men for their really shitty behavior. When you're more assertive and more confident when it comes to portraying what you're trying to say, men will always respond or go back to, she's such a bitch. Oh, she doesn't know how to do certain things. But it's a clear sign if or maybe she wasn't that clear within the discussion, and this drastically changes the way in which men operate. And therefore, if the backlash is necessarily bad, we think in the long run this backlash is something that we're okay fighting for. Lastly, on utility clash, and here's where it really proves to you why opposition loses, and I'll prove to you an independent pathway to success after that. Let's talk about the utility clash, because it's very clear within government what we wanted, which is two levels. Here's where I'm going to introduce to you symbolic interactionism, which is necessarily the psychology of people and the language that we use. When we indoctrinated as cultures, for example, in Asian cultures, to be more respectful, to be more like submissive, is the reality of how we operate our daily lives via the language that we use. Because every day we have conversations using that same lexicon. It is only when you break out of the lexicon, when you're able to break out of this inferior mindset, oftentimes preached upon you within your lifestyle. Therefore, it is this mental break that happens within government's world where we actively discourage the usage of submissive language. This is where psychology matters. It is about making sure that women psychologically are able to liberate themselves from the constant belief that they're inferior to men. I'll take the pure eye, Mior.
Yes, this may work psychologically, but you don't prove why the patriarchy is likely going to accommodate to it. Even you point out they're likely going to call them a bitch or a
Listen
she-wolf.
to the argument, because the explanation was never always about breaking the patriarchy. We're giving you the best case scenario. We're telling you that even if it's not about changing patriarchy, it's about a process of internal liberation that can happen towards women. What was your impact then? I'll talk about it later. But the practical outlets are even more clearer. The explanation around how you're able to control discussions within the boardroom or within normal day discussions or your team meetings, etc. When Chloe wants to tell you that this is something important and you say, shut up, these are things that prove to you that women are oftentimes sidelined by virtue of the language that they use. It is only when you're able to break through that you're able to push for fewer things. Let's then deal with what they attempted to prove to you, panel, and prove to you how shallow this really is. Because the argumentation was literally expression. It is, expression is extremely important, but it's extremely nebulous. I'm still confused as to what is the tangible impact behind this expression. If insofar as Gov has multiple layers proven to you how it's impactful and harmful for women on the ground, this means that the have fun narrative that opposition has is one that's inherently bad, because this holistically affects women on all levels and all stratas. By virtue of that, it's very apparent the clearest Gov ballot.
We thank the Gov Web speaker for that fine speech, inviting on the opposition web speaker here.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
Cool, yes to both.
Okay, let me just set up my timer. POI is in the chat, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think, therefore I am. Panel, I think thinking is just very good in general, and perhaps government should have done more of it if they wanted to win this debate here. I think I just want to call out some explicit problems from their side before I get into the actual clashes here. I think one, they're so convenient in their framing as to how they want to achieve their things. At the same time, they're also strawmanning us in the first place. What do I mean here? I think one, for some reason, they think this debate is about the narrative that women should be more aggressive and more assertive, when this is simply about linguistics. So they don't prove why this narrative about feminine linguistics and abandoning this and discouraging this is the tipping point to making people more confident on their side of the world. Insofar then that people are likely going to be the same people on your side of the world, people who probably weren't confident enough to do this. We don't understand why this narrative of discouraging a linguistic behavior is one that's going to shift the entire being to be someone who's more confident and more assertive. Sure, maybe through text it's far easier for them to retaliate, but it's very unlikely then that these women who you want to say on our side of the world are people who are shy and not confident are suddenly going to become the ultimate I'm going to go out there and get these people sort of people, assuming then that your only thing that changes on your side of the world is the narrative about feminine linguistic behavior. This doesn't change anything about confidence. This doesn't change anything about the incentives in terms of the ambitions of women. Then I think it's a bit unfair for you to take this, just make that leap in the first place without at least proving to me why it happens in the first place. Then secondly, then I think they're a bit dismissive about our case. Our case is not saying that we just want to let people have expressions and that's the be all and end of it. We tell you then that it's far better for the movement to actually be true to itself and still protect the women who don't want to opt into these things in the first place. Because I think they don't really cater to people who don't want to opt into this in the first place. The entire case is about, all women should be CEOs, all women should be in the men's spaces and be really big. They don't cater to the fact that some women simply don't want to do these things. What happens to these women on your side then? Because these are inherently more vulnerable women who need to be protected. On your side of the world, these women are forced to do these things, or you simply just put them by the wayside because you're prioritizing one over the other. Then they say that on their side they have and then they try to call us uncharitable by saying that we are pushing a very bad mechanism onto them. And it's likely on their side, it's going to be a positive feedback loop. I think this is disingenuous and they're just copping out here, because you cannot say that it's only going to be a positive feedback loop and you're not going to like look down on women who don't opt into your new narrative. Because one, the motion says actively discourage. So it's not enough to say that one is a viable option. You have to actively compare it against what you're trying to discourage by saying that this is something that's, if not that it's bad, at least it's worse off than this. This already implies the fact that one is better than the other, and you're already assigning a value to it and devaluing feminine linguistic behaviors. This means then that you still have to tell women, sure, you're not saying that they're shit for doing this sort of things, but you have to tell them, oh, this is better than that. That's already going to lead to an implicit sense of like inferiorness amongst them, because they're always going to feel like, oh, is the way I speak not as good as something else? We still think that this internalizes under them. I'll touch more into this in the clashes then. So 3 clashes here. One, about the principle and the actual core goals of feminism. I think government does not care at all about the feminist movement because they don't engage with this at all. I think Chloe gave you many reasons as to why this is just principally inconsistent with what the feminist movement is fighting for. One is the proliferation of women's rights and opportunities. 2, it's also about protecting women and ensure that they have freedom of expression, not having to buy into patriarchal structures, and just ensuring that they can, be themselves and still be valued as the same as men. This is principally inconsistent on side government because one, you are excluding women and telling them what to do. This goes against what Umar says, because he said that, oh, you have an authority to tell them what to do. This is what the feminist movement is about. He said, no, it's not about authority of telling them what to do. It's just the fact that the feminist movement is one that's supposed to protect women and tell them that you can exist on a spectrum. Your side then actively excludes women. And we tell you that this is doubly principally inconsistent when the women you're excluding are ones who exhibit more feminine behaviors, thereby assigning a higher value towards masculine traits. This is not a debate. It's literally in the inverse side that one is seen as more feminine, one is seen as more masculine. Therefore, on your side of the world, you are literally saying to women that the more masculine one is the better one. Therefore, you are assigning value towards patriarchal sort of narratives and saying this is better. That's again principally inconsistent. Before I move on to the next questions, yes, POI.
So your claim on exclusion and fracturing applies to lots of things. Answer: when, if, ever, is it fair for a feminist movement to discourage women from something?
It's only good to discourage something if it's something that harms the others. We tell you, and you never proved why engaging in feminine linguistic behaviors is one that disrupts the unity of the feminist movement, or it's one which encroaches upon other spaces of feminist movements. We say there's no validity in excluding it. Then that was the onus on your side. You didn't prove it. Moving on then to the next one in terms of practical outcomes. What does government say? Government says that, oh, this is good, and this is why they clash with choice feminism, saying that it's not in choice feminism isn't good if the choices you make aren't that wide or you don't have any choices to put from. They want to value them in terms of actually getting women into these successful spaces then, because for some reason, this is the key to unlocking confidence. I think I already told you why. They don't prove why this one narrative is one that suddenly makes all the women confident, or even if they are confident and we take them at their best, it doesn't prove why it's likely going to work in terms of their success. Because in here, the entire argument is contingent on the fact that these women reach these successful spaces so that they have more privileges and more ability to make choices here. This is already harmful, one, because it's already exclusionary, because not every woman is going to succeed on your world simply because a lot of them aren't going to opt into it. But even in the ones who opt into it, you don't prove to us why likely everyone who wants to opt into this is going to be able to succeed to the degree you want, where they can then make the choices that you are trying to push here. So in terms of not proving why it is likely to be successful and your argument is contingent on the success, you cannot prove to us why you're likely going to get this choice that you want on your side. We tell you the autonomy is far better when it's one that happens in the beginning, where women can already choose ways in which they want to express themselves then. Secondly, it's about the confidence. I think we told you why you don't prove you get confidence here. This debate isn't about narrative on confidence. Women can still have feministic linguistic behaviors and still be confident. That is something that isn't exclusive. Moving then, why we tell you practical outcomes are far better on our side. One, it's just far more difficult for the feminist movement to function if you are actively supporting the patriarchy and supporting patriarchal structures. We tell you then, it's far easier when you support more women, simply because you have a stronger voter base then. When you have more people who are unified for your movement, is where you get less likely disunity or like more participation in your movements then. Because we tell you, fine, you want to say it's a stock case where you can get splinter groups, just because it's stock doesn't mean it's a wrong thing. If women are actively being excluded from your movements, they're very likely going to not participate or participate in a way that's contradictory to whatever your movement wants. This is a harm you have to contend with. You can't just hand wave it away there. So the way here is simple. Even if on our side, where we have to pick one over the other in terms of protecting more feminine women or trying to push more masculine, like coded women, we tell you then that it's far better that you protect the most vulnerable actors, which are the ones who on your side of the world, like as you say, are probably less confident and have these things then, because of the fact that they're like that by nature. They have no other counterbalances to protect them. On your side of the world, your masculine women are likely going to want to be masculine anyway. We don't have to tell them to do it or not to do it because we allow them the choice to do it in the first place. On our side of the world, then, the women who are more feminine in terms of their linguistic structure will not be protected on your side because simply you are excluding these people and telling them it's wrong. If they continue to perpetuate or do these sort of things, then you are actively not providing them any sort of support systems because you keep telling them, oh, you should do this instead, you should do this instead. The most vulnerable people on your side of the world are far worse off then. We tell you that internalization is far worse on your side because not only are men saying you're bad, but literally even your fellow feminists are saying that you're doing something wrong. For all those reasons, then side with opposition.
We thank the opposition whip speaker for that fine speech and very on up reply.
Okay, just checking audio visible. All right, cool. Thank you. So I know me and Mior sounds like washing machines and we're just washing everything out of the debate, but honestly, this isn't really my fault because I feel there are a lot of things that government brings that are just non-contentious in the round and isn't comparative or realistic as to how the real world works. Let's take a look at some of the things that they want to bring you and especially how they achieve any forms of benefits. Realistically, let's just boil this down to two benefits that they bring. I'm not just being uncharitable, I'll explain them later on as well. Firstly, this idea as to how you change things in the way in which that we are perceived within society and how you increase things like girl boss feminism somehow, right? So firstly, this isn't a problem with the language that women use in order to get the positions that they want. It's a problem with the patriarchy. It's a problem in the way in which men perceive women in general. It doesn't change whether or not you use ... in your sentence or you become more assertive because you will always be seen as someone that's secondary in humanity. And that's just the problem of the patriarchy right now. So even if you do use assertive languages or you stop using feminine behavior or linguistics or whatever, these aren't the things that stop men from being sexist and justifying their behaviors regardless. So that incredibly high burden isn't something that they prove within the round. More importantly, that isn't going to be able to be defeated. That idea of the patriarchy isn't going to be defeated through the ideas of what language these women use. I agree with Akasyah. This isn't the only case, but we responded to multiple other things as well. Second, this idea about physically breaking the glass ceiling. Psychologically breaking a glass ceiling, what am I saying? Sorry. So the problem with this argument is that I'm unsure as to where exactly this places during the round. Because if the idea is that you psychologically break glass ceilings, where does this exactly materialize and how does that impact actually come? Because if you feel more assertive, but society still doesn't give you the jobs that you want to give, that you wanted because they're still patriarchal and they're still discriminatory against women, how exactly does that ideas of any form of benefit actually manifest within the round? I'm unsure as to how exactly that idea of breaking that glass ceiling is going to be any noteworthy achievement that women can make, because the ideas of them being assertive and feeling that forms of confidence doesn't exactly come from the language that they use. Because if you take a look at government's case, the reason as to why they even want to change any of the language that they use currently is to be able to appease or to be able to make sure that they're more compatible with whatever nonsense going on in the workplace right now to begin with. So the direct internalization isn't going to be something like, oh, I feel happier because I'm using male language and therefore I feel more confident. It's more just the fact that I am forced to use this language because otherwise I'm not going to be taken as seriously. And the problem with this is that these things can only materialize the point which that you're receiving the benefits and actually impacted through these decisions. So if you aren't getting the jobs that you want to because it's still patriarchal, you aren't going to be able to claim the benefits of breaking the psychological glass barrier because you still won't see the benefits of whatever actions that you're currently pursuing, or you still won't see the benefits of not being able to type the way that you want to. Two other issues within the round. Firstly, the idea of principle. When exactly do we discourage? I think like Umar asked these questions in POI through Mior, right? The problem with this is that Mior's answer is perfectly valid and it was something that was said throughout consistently in all speeches, because this is something that isn't going to be, that we aren't going to be, or we will only discourage something if it's actively harming other members within the same community. You need to prove as to how exactly does this do it, because if the idea is that it's fine, you can do it because it's increased confrontational, then you're still unprotecting the women who don't want to co-opt these forms of behaviors in the first place. Because take a look at the same things that you want to talk about, because if the biggest benefit of being able to stray away from using feminine linguistic behavior is the idea that you feel more assertive and you feel more confident, people who do want to become CEOs or people who do want to be a girl boss, for example, and they realize that these are things that are incredibly important and they have to have these traits in order to be successful, realistically, these individuals are going to do it in any way. Under both sides of the house, feminist movement doesn't actively encourage you in order to speak in these forms of language in the first place, which means that our side doesn't shun away individuals who do want to express themselves in that light to begin with. The idea of expression here is incredibly important, because the way in which that you want to express yourself is one of the only things that they shouldn't be able to control, because that's what the feminist movement wants to fight for. You fight for equality because you want to be seen as equal to your other counterparts. You don't fight for it and then you just co-opt and become the other counterpart in order to achieve the same benefits. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition reply speaker for that fine speech, inviting on the government reply speaker. Here.
I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If women accepted that not voting was a way of life, the suffrage movement would not have happened. If women continued to normalize the separation of gender roles, women will now still be slaving away at homes rather than working in offices. It is in Ott's world where you get the stagnancy of women, that when women are harmed most. I want to first clarify the burden. Our burden was never to topple the patriarchy. That is obviously impossible, and you cannot assign a burden that you also cannot fulfill. Our burden is to prove to you that the use of feminine linguistic behavior is a norm that ought to be opposed because it entrenches patriarchal perspective towards women. Our claim was not that women can overthrow the patriarchy, it's that the learned helplessness from feminine linguistic behaviors affects their personal view of themselves and how other people view women as a whole. It's just a simple more harms than good debate. Second, on the idea of confidence and feminine linguistic behavior, I think it is very shameful for Ott to say that you can be confident and also use feminine linguistic behavior. We frame to you from first, it is inherently antithetical because you cannot dislodge the societal perceptions in which the tangible values of confidence is one that you cannot derive from using feminine linguistic behaviors. This looks like not giving women who seem hesitant job opportunities. This means that Ott is only debating in a vacuum, and the only thing left standing on Ott is the idea of choice, protection, and expression. But before that is that the idea of the skewed stakeholder analysis that they have. They say it is bad when you lock people out of using feminine linguistic behaviors, but this is precisely the people who have been indoctrinated to use feminine linguistic behavior to begin with, and Ott conceded to this, that women are forced to use it because of the patriarchy. This means these are the very vulnerable people that we ought to protect, and that we actually protect on our side from continuing the inflicted of the harms of feminine linguistic behaviors. Next, on the only claim that Ott has standing, which is idea of choice. Ott wants to win on women's choice, but for this to fly, they must prove the unique benefit of this choice, that there is some form of net positive good, but it never illustrated to you how this empowerment actually looks like when women use this kind of feminine linguistic behavior. They only say that it is a form of empowerment, it's a form of choice, but they never actually illustrated to you how this empowerment looks like. Second, they also prove to you the subset of women who use this feminine linguistic behavior as a form of core identity. It's unclear who are these women that are actually using this feminine linguistic behavior as their core identity, right? That means absent of this, you must weigh therefore this claim lesser because it's unclear as to how important this is to the majority of women. Compared to us, we told you uniquely that feminine linguistic behavior is one that harms all women. This means that Mior never listened to any of God's speeches when we told you that it actually harms women, right? This means it bypasses a lot of the argument on expression, because your expression of feminine linguistic behavior is one that harms other women because it delegitimizes women that want to be more assertive. It delegitimizes women who want to challenge the current norms. It continues to empower the harms surrounding feminine linguistic behavior, that it is okay for you to be submissive in the face of patriarchy, even if it comes at the expense of other women who wants to go against the patriarchy. They refuse to engage with our framing, that it was clear that these unique harms get exacerbated when it interacts with other opposing linguistic behavior, such as more assertive behavior that is more prominent and common towards men. Therefore, Ott loses because they're debating in a vacuum with no real tangible impact in real life. Versus the comparative, we told you that the change of language changes your behavior to be one that is more confident, no engagement from Ott. Therefore, the clear pathway to winning on us is that the first touch point, the reclaiming your space and making yourself known, is when you break through your personal prison. It's about slowly changing your biases that you must be inferior and accommodating to other people. It is when now you become more assertive, and through the legitimization of this by the movement, and now you're doing this with other members of the movement, this form of collective push is what makes it more feasible. Therefore, even if you don't buy this, it is clear that even on an individual level, it at least makes a woman more willing to be confident and more courageous to be confident. Let's just gut check. What's so bad about just making a woman feel more confident in a space with dominating men? Therefore, then, clearest gov ballot ever.